Well, again, thank you all for joining us today for our webinar. We will be talking about COVID-19 supplemental sick pay, and I am really excited that we have Patrick Moody with us again from Barsamian Moody, who's going to walk us through this, hopefully answer some questions that I know that all of you will have, and just be able to make some sense of what COVID sick pay looks like and how we go about implementing it into our businesses. So with that, I'm going to actually hand it off to Patrick. But one of the other things I did want to mention is that I know, again, that all of you are going to have lots of questions. So go ahead and please put them in the chat function, and Pat will be answering them kind of as we go and just trying to answer as many questions as we can. So with that, Pat, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thanks, Teresa and Rosie. I appreciate you guys having me today. Can you guys hear me okay? No problems?
Yes, we can. Thanks,
Great.
Pat.
Very good. Okay, so good morning, everybody. Let's see here. There we go. All right, so we're going to talk about this new COVID supplemental paid sick leave this morning. The good thing about this is in theory, it's not that difficult to understand. The problem, of course, is going to be in implementing it when half your employees want to all take leave at the same time. So that's the difficult part, but the theory behind it and how it actually works is really not that difficult. I know I get lots of questions about it, and I'll answer all your questions. So as they said, if you have questions, type them into the chat function. Someone will interrupt me and I'll answer the questions as we go. I think that's easier than sort of waiting to the end. But when we sort of get to the end, don't worry. If you've got questions, I'll sit here and answer questions until everybody's got their questions answered. So don't worry about that. You'll get your questions answered. So the new COVID supplemental paid sick leave was part of Senate Bill 95 that the California legislature passed and the governor signed on March 19th. It became effective 10 days later on the 29th of March. So it is alive and going as of right now. The one real tricky part on this is that it is retroactive back to January 1 of this year, January 1 of 2021. So if we will remember, last year we had the federal government passed an act on COVID sick leave, and the state passed an act on COVID sick leave. The difference between the two was they were fairly similar, and they really had to do with the amount of employees you had was the biggest difference. So if you had 500 or fewer, you had the federal act controlling your COVID sick leave, and if you had 500 or more employees, then you had the state act governing your COVID sick leave. But the actual acts themselves were pretty similar, and so they weren't too hard. The basic concept being if you had a full-time employee, they were entitled to up to 80 hours of COVID sick leave. They both expired by their terms on December 31st of this past year. And the real big difference there was that the federal government allowed you, if you wanted to continue offering COVID sick leave under the federal act. So if you had 500 or fewer employees, you could continue to provide additional COVID sick leave into 2021 and take the tax credit that you're able to take for providing sick leave under the federal act. That was the biggest difference between the Fed and the state in terms of the actual act itself. The acts themselves was that the federal government allowed you to recoup the cost of providing COVID sick leave by taking a credit against your quarterly payroll taxes. The state act did not allow that. So the federal government said you can continue to do that into the first quarter of this year of 2021 and take the credits by continuing to provide COVID sick leave. And then they passed, one of the first acts that they passed after the new administration came in was to extend that out to September 30, 2021. And so when California then readopted this new SB 95, they tied it into that same date. So this goes to September 30, 2021. So it's effective for leave between January 1, retroactive back to January 1, and moving forward to September 30, 2021. No one will be able to start new leave after September 30, 2021. But if they are taking leave as of that time, they will be able to continue utilizing their leave until it's either expired or they don't need it anymore after September 30, 2021. Another huge difference between last year's California Act and this year's California Act is last year, remember, was 500 or more employees. This year, it's any employers with 25 or more employees. So lots and lots and lots of employers who were not covered by the California Act last year are now, in fact, covered by the California Act. So keep in mind that as of right now, we've got the California Act going, and we've got the federal act going through September 30, 2021. The big thing is it applies to 25 or more employees, public employers, private employers, it doesn't matter. If you've got 25 or more, then you are covered by this law. The leave that they get, and we'll talk again as to how much it is, it's immediately available. There's no qualifying period. You don't have to have X amount of hours. You don't have to have X amount of months. It's in addition also to any currently provided sick leave that you have. So if you have a company policy of providing sick leave, this is in addition to it. It's also in addition to your required sick leave. California employers 3 days, 24 hours of mandated sick leave, and 40 hours in Arizona. If you have to be happen to be in one of those local ordinances or local areas that has a individual ordinance that provides additional leave, this is in addition to that. So it's above and beyond anything else. You can't substitute leave that you already provide or the required sick leave from the state in place of this. This is separate and apart from that. So definitions, employer really is anything. If you employ people and you have employees, then you're an employer. And if you have 25 or more, you're covered by this law. A covered employee is any employee who's unable to either work or telework. That's a big difference here, is that if they can't telework, then they're qualified for this leave if there's a qualifying reason. So we'll cover the qualifying reasons in a minute, but anybody who's able to unable to work or unable to telework because of a qualifying reason is a covered employee for this statute. When you count the employees, you have to count all of your employees that are direct hires plus any FLC employers or temp agency employees. So you must count everybody. It's not just direct hire. So if you've got FLCs providing employees, you count those. If you have people from a temporary agency, you count those. The state sort of takes the basic presumption that you as a direct employer and your FLC or your temp agency both have sufficient control over the conditions of employment to qualify, so you'd have to add them up. It also includes full-time, part-time, seasonal, those people who are on leave, those people who are temporary employees, whatever it is. You count up how many employees you have on the date somebody needs it. So if you're right at that 24, or 25 or 26 employee mark, you would count how many employees that are there as of the time somebody needs leave, and you're going to add them up and see if you got 25 or more. I just saw a question that said that there's conflicting information on whether you would count FLCs or not, and it's not directly in here. You're going to find that information elsewhere when they talk about how you count employees for things like this, and they're going to say that you need to count FLC employees. You're not going to find it in the statute. I don't even believe it's in the FAQs, which frankly I have open in front of me, and I'm not seeing that question is answered even in the FAQs, I think because it's answered elsewhere. But if whoever asked that question, if you want to, email me later, you can email me and I can explain how that comes up to that. But okay, so Sarah says, I was in a call last week with a different law group and they said the opposite. So that's the question. Yeah, you'll probably find different people have different interpretations of things, and that could be the case, but I'm pretty confident that you count FLC employees. Another one is do you only count those FLC employees while they're actually working for you? And it's yes. So you would look at when is the person needing supplemental sick leave, and you count up how many employees you have as of that time. So if 3 weeks later you're going to have a bunch of FLC employees, that doesn't count. But if you count up you count up the employees as of the time somebody is requesting leave. So that's when you count it up. Why am I not forwarding? Okay. Oop, did I go too far? So reasons for the leave. There's a number of reasons for the leave. They're a little different than they were last year. So you need to keep in mind that there are more reasons for leave this year than there were last year. And this is laid out really well. I've got a link later to the FAQs that the Division of Labor Standards Enforcement, the Labor Commissioner, put out. I've got a link to those FAQs. I would strongly suggest everybody read all of the FAQs. There's not that many. They're easy to read. They're surprisingly easy to understand. They're very well laid out, and so it's one of those things that I strongly suggest you to read, particularly when you're looking at what are the covered reasons, because again, they are different than they were last year. And so I know we kind of got used to, at least for this law, what were covered reasons, even though there were other laws that had different covered reasons, and I know how confusing that is. But go ahead and look at the FAQs, and they answer a lot of questions really well. So covered reasons include if the employee is subject to a quarantine or an isolation period, again related to COVID-19. It's got to be something related to COVID-19 because this is what this whole statute's about. But if they're subject to a quarantine or an isolation period, or they've been advised to self-quarantine. So sometimes you'll see, this first one is, sometimes you'll see like the county health department come in and tell people that they have to quarantine. We've had a number of clients that have had that happen, where either they've had a large outbreak and the amongst their employees, and the county will come in and say, hey, everybody needs to quarantine. You need to shut down for 2 weeks. That has happened. So that's a situation where they've been told to quarantine or isolate. If they've been advised by their doctor, their healthcare provider, to self-quarantine due to concerns related to COVID-19. Here's the biggie that's different. If they are attending an appointment to get their vaccine, they are entitled to paid leave to go get their vaccine. This is going to be a tricky one, and I'll talk about this in a minute, where you're going to have to think about how between January 1 and March 29, you are tracking people that took time off to go get a vaccine. That's entitled to get, they're entitled to get paid for that. So that's one of the reasons that they can get supplemental paid sick leave. So we have to be careful about that. Some more reasons: experiencing symptoms related to COVID-19 vaccine. So some people have reactions to the vaccine. I've known people that have ended up in bed for like a week because of that. A lot of times it's that second shot. They get the first shot, they have no problem. They get a little sore arm or something like that, or they might run a small fever for a little bit, but then they go get that second shot, and it really kind of hits them pretty hard. And like I said, I've known people who've ended up in the hospital. I've known people that end up in bed for a week. I've known people that have had splitting headaches and whatnot, and it really does affect them. Now, my 84-year-old father got both shots, and it didn't faze him in the slightest. So you really don't know what's going to happen. But this is one of the reasons, if they get the vaccine and they have an adverse reaction, they're entitled to supplemental paid sick leave. If they're experiencing symptoms and they're going to the doctor, that's supplemental paid sick leave. if they're caring for a family member who's subject to either an isolation order or quarantine, and they have to, or they've been advised to self-quarantine, and your employee is caring for that family member, and then they are entitled to take supplemental paid sick leave. And then the final one is caring for a child whose school or place of daycare is closed or otherwise unavailable due to COVID-19. So I know that that's really sort of all over the board right now. Some schools are open, some schools are not, some schools are doing part live instruction, some and part online instruction, and they are all over the board on that stuff. So some people are giving, some districts are giving parents the choice what to do, what not to do. So that one you're just going to have to sort of play by ear and see if the school is open and they're asking for it, then they don't get it. But if the school is closed and they're asking for it, then they do. So you're going to need to do a little investigation on that maybe. If for some reason you think, hey, my kids are in school and that person goes, their kid goes to the same school I go to, why are they asking for leave because the school is closed? So you can check in on that kind of thing. Handling requests. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, there are a slew of questions that
okay,
just
let's do it. Yeah.
I think let's start with Carol. Had the question about the Families First and asked if it had been expanded to cover all of those same requirements under the California leave.
I don't believe that they've expanded the reasons for coverage under the Family First Coronavirus Release Act, the federal one. I don't think they've changed their reasons for it. So that's going to get a little tricky if you're trying to, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit, if you're trying to supplement the California requirements with the federal leave so that you can take the tax credits. It's going to have to be a reason that qualifies both under the federal statute and the state statute. So if for some reason it doesn't qualify under the federal statute, you're not going to be able to supplement that leave with the California leave or meet that leave, the California leave with the federal one and take the tax credit. So it's got to be both. And I don't believe that the federal has been expanded to coincide with California's. So that's going to be a tricky area where you're just going to have to make a call on which one it's covered by.
Okay, great. And then Melissa's got a question about if there's an employee that's experiencing symptoms of COVID and they go in for a test and test negative, would they still qualify for the supplemental paid sick leave?
Yes, because going to get a medical diagnosis is one of the covered reasons. It doesn't say that they have to be positive. It just says they have to be going for a diagnosis, and going in and testing negative is going to be covered.
Okay, great. And then we got some questions coming around vaccinations. So if we have an employee that goes to get a vaccine outside of work hours, so like the workday has actually concluded, are they still entitled to compensation, or solely if they go to a vaccine appointment during work hours?
It's not 100% clear in either the FAQs or in the statute itself, but I have to believe that the labor commissioner would say, even if they're going outside of work hours, they're going to be entitled to get paid for that. Now, I don't see that as something that would run into overtime. So I think that's going to be straight time, but I think they're going to have to get compensated for that. It doesn't say that anywhere, but I can't believe that the labor commissioner would say, well, you can just keep them at work all day, and therefore when they go after work, you don't have to pay them. I can't believe that's what they would rule.
Yeah. Okay. What about, do you have some guidance in terms of a minimum amount of hours that need to be paid to an employee for a vaccination appointment?
I think what you're going to have to do is kind of ask them how much time they took. And I think anything up to a few hours would probably be reasonable. Now, if they say, hey, it took me 14 hours, well, you can question that. If they say it took me 8 hours, you can question that. If they say it took me 2 hours, it took me 2 hours to get my first shot. So I don't know that you can question that. It's kind of screwy because they specifically say you're not allowed to ask for proof. You're not allowed to ask for confirmation that they did it. You kind of have to take their word for it unless you have reason to believe that they're not telling you the truth. And the example that they tell you in the FAQs is you have an employee who says, hey, I went to get the vaccine, and you look at their Facebook page and they were at the beach. Then you can question them about that. So something like that. But if they say, hey, it took me a couple of hours to go get it, I would pay them the couple of hours. If they ask for an unreasonable amount, then you might start to question, why are you saying it took you 7 hours to get the vaccine? It doesn't take anybody 7 hours to get the vaccine. So it's one of those where you're going to have to make a call on it. If they say, hey, look, I went and I was the first in line and it took me 30 minutes. Okay, great. It took them 30 minutes.
Okay, that's great. And just to reiterate, we can't ask for proof.
Right. You cannot. Yep. You cannot ask for proof.
Okay. And like everybody is blowing up here. What if you had an employee that had a reaction prior to March 29th and missed work?
I would say that's going to be covered because remember, this whole statute is retroactive to January 1. That's what's going to be, I think, the toughest part of dealing with this thing is because there wasn't a statute in place unless you were doing the voluntary continuation of the federal act. So a lot of people were not tracking why people were taking leave. And so if you didn't track why people were taking time off, if they didn't say, hey, look, I got the vaccine and I had a bad reaction and I'm staying home for 3 days or whatever it might be, you may not know. Now, if they come to you and say, hey, I had the vaccine in February and I had a bad reaction and I missed 3 days of work for it, you almost have to accept their word the way the statute's written. It's kind of screwy because, again, you're not allowed to require proof. You kind of have to take their word for it.
Okay.
So, and I understand how difficult that's going to be, but unless you have the documentation as to why they took leave that says, no, you told me you were going to, somewhere, and now you're saying it was due to the vaccine, you're kind of going to have to take their word for it.
Okay. Is all supplemental COVID pay, no matter which qualified reason, at 100% pay?
Yes, there's only one pay scale under this one. It's 100%. It is, pro rata based on whether, if you're a full-time employee, it's 100%. If you're a part-time employee, you get a pro rata share of hours, but the pay is 100%. And so you have to look at how many hours they missed, and it's at their regular rate of pay. We'll get to it a slide a little later that has the formula on it, and the formula is also laid out in those FAQs that I linked to, and it's limited to the $511 per day and $5,100 over the entire time, but it's 100% pay.
Okay. Amanda's got a question about the tax credit.
Okay. I will admit that is my weakest area on this because I'm not a tax person.
Okay. She says the credit can only be taken if the reason for COVID pay falls under the Fed qualifications only.
Yes, that's absolutely true. Because remember, the state act, neither last year's state act nor this year's state act allow you to take that tax credit. That is solely a function of the federal act. The state acts do not allow for the tax credit, only the federal act. So it has to comply with one of the reasons for the federal act for you to pay it under that act and get the tax credit. Now, so the nice thing is that we're able to take leave under the federal act and pay it and take credit for it as part of the state requirement. So you don't have to pay, two separate banks of hours, right? It's one bank of hour. And if it qualifies for the federal reason, and they take 8 hours for the federal reason, a qualifying reason, you can also credit 8 hours against the state bank and take the tax credit if it's a qualifying reason under the federal act. Does that make
Perfect.
sense?
Yeah. Okay, I think we got a couple more, like they're still like, are you sure, Pat? So we've got Myra says, so if an employee goes on a Sunday to get the vaccination, compensation is still required?
That is the way I read it, that if they go get the vaccine, they are entitled to paid time to go get the vaccine. Because again, here, think of it this way. Think of it this way, is if you have an obligation to provide up to 80 hours of paid sick leave, and you get around that by saying, I'm going to work everybody hours that overlap all of the clinics during the workday, so they can't go during the workday, and the only time they can go on the weekend, and therefore I don't have to provide it. Does anybody really think that the labor commissioner is going to allow you to do that? And I think you will all tell yourself that the answer is no.
Yeah, wear that labor commissioner hat. Okay, and then we got one last question, and we can move on. Can we ask for proof as long as it's not required in order for them to receive paid time off?
Okay, so if I understand this correctly, and I think you can in fact ask for who has said that who has gotten a vaccination. So I've got clients who have said, you don't have to be vaccinated to work. We're not requiring, it's not mandatory. You don't need to show us proof to get time off, but so we can determine whether we need to have more vaccination clinics, whether we can, do contact tracing, whether we can figure out, job assignments and this, that, and the other thing. We would like for people to let us know if they have been vaccinated. I believe that is fully okay, because you're not conditioning anything on them giving you proof. You're just saying, we would like to know who has been vaccinated for other reasons. I think that's going to be allowed. But I don't, what they say you can't do is say, you don't get supplemental paid sick leave unless you show me confirmation that you went and got the test, for example, or you got a vaccination, or your doctor says you were sick because of COVID. You can't require that. But for some other reason, you are allowed to ask. Now, what I don't think you can do is require people to tell you, but I think you can ask people to tell you.
Okay. How about one more?
Oh, yeah.
Brenda's got a question. If you're required to note the amount of supplemental paid sick leave on their wage statement, how do you handle seasonal employees whose hours vary and may not be 40 hours in a week? Okay. How many hours would you put on their wage statement?
So there's a formula. Again, we're going to show you this formula in a little bit. And what it says is that you look at an initial calculation based upon the hours that they're working, and you say variable and say 33 hours based upon the formula that we're going to show you in a little bit. And then when they actually ask for leave, you redo the calculation over the newer time period and figure out how many hours they're actually entitled to. Okay. So it's a double calculation. You do it once to show them what their initial bank is, but you have to label that bank as variable and use that word. Don't use some other word. Don't use part-time. Don't use, whatever. Use the word variable, because it's actually quoted in the statute. Use the word variable. And you figure out how many hours they're entitled to based upon their pro rata portion of 40 hours. And then when they come back later and say, okay, I actually now need it, I need to use my sick leave, you recalculate it and figure out how many hours they actually have based upon what they've worked in a more recent time period.
Great. Thank you, Pat. Let's keep on moving. I got a couple more, but I think we'll pop them in. Okay. I think we'll end up answering some of these.
Sure. So handling requests for supplemental paid sick leave. The employee is allowed to make an oral or written request, so they don't have to do anything magical. I think if somebody says, hey, I'm going to get the vaccine, I think that's a request for supplemental paid sick leave. Gosh, I've got COVID symptoms, I'm staying home. That's a request for supplemental paid sick leave. There's no magic words that they have to say. They don't have to say, I want my supplemental paid sick leave. I think if they say anything that would put a reasonable person on notice that it's a qualifying reason, then they are entitled to it, and that's a valid request. They get to choose how much they use, up to the full entitlement for the employee based on the number of hours worked. You figure out how many hours they work, if it's part-time or if they're full-time, it's 80 hours. If they work 40 hours a week, then they get 2 weeks of, they get 80 hours. It's up to them to choose how much that they're going to use. We cannot, again, here, we covered this a bunch. We cannot deny sick leave based on a lack of medical certification from the healthcare provider. We can't condition it on certification. If we believe reasonably that they are not telling us the truth, we can investigate, but we have to be able to state some sort of reasonable belief as to why we think they are not entitled to it. Again, the example they use in the FAQs is somebody saying, hey, I went to get the vaccine, or I was home quarantined, and we see on their Facebook page that they were at the beach or they were in Vegas or wherever it might be. Because this is so sort of loose in how they can make the request, written or oral. Everybody's going to make an oral request. Very few people are going to make a written request. Most people are going to make an oral request. And it doesn't have to be anything specific. We are really going to have to get the frontline supervisors on board, knowing that they've got to tell us, in the HR office, that so-and-so has requested leave. These people up front are the employer for, just like it's a harassment or discrimination case or whatever it might be, supervisors are the employer. And if they can make an oral request of the employer and they tell their supervisor, hey, I need to go, I've got the symptoms, I'm going to go get a test to see if I've got COVID. That's a request for supplemental paid sick leave, and those people need to know that they have to pass it on to whoever in your organization gets those requests, whether it's HR, whether it's the payroll department, whoever it might be. We have to have that frontline supervision dialed in on this stuff, and they've got to be taking part and know that they are an important and integral part of this process. They can't just let it slide, because they'll tell you there are plaintiffs firms out there looking to sue over this stuff. And so it is important that you train your frontline supervision so that they know if somebody says the right thing, that red flag has to go up, and they got to say, I got to tell somebody about this. I've got to tell somebody about this, that so-and-so asked for time off. You need to make sure that step, that's where things are going to fall apart. I've been doing this almost 30 years, and that's where stuff falls apart, is between the frontline supervision and getting it into the office so that the office knows what to do. That's where things will fall apart. So we got to train to get people on board with that. So that's super, super important. It's not forwarding. There we go. Oop. How much leave? Okay, we talked about this a little bit. It's up to 80 hours if you're a full-time employee. If you're scheduled to work 40 hours a week, in 2 weeks before the leave is taken, you get 80 hours of leave. You're a full-time employee. If you're a part-time employee, it's a screwy thing. You look at how much they've worked each day in the 6 months preceding the date the leave's taken, and you figure out the average and you multiply it times 14. So that's the formula. It's a screwy formula, but that's the formula. And you figure out how many hours they're entitled to it. So when now on, we should be getting at least the first paycheck after this thing has become active, and we have to have that bank on there on the check stub, right? So for part-time employees, that's the employee, or that's the amount of hours you're going to list in their bank initially. You're going to label it variable, like we talked about, label it variable. And then when they come back, in 2 months and request leave, you redo it. So you're going to redo this calculation, this formula, and figure out how many hours they actually have available. Hope that makes sense. So here's just a little sample that they provide. 520 hours over 6 months. They worked 182 days. 520 divided by 182 is 2.857 hours. You multiply that by 14, and that's 40 hours. So that's how the formula works. It's in the FAQs, and that's what you're going to use. If they've worked less than 6 months, you calculate over the entire employment period. And if they're newly hired and they've worked less than 2 weeks, you look at how much have they worked, how many hours have they worked, and that's how much they're entitled to take. So if they've worked 80 hours in 2 weeks, they get 80 hours. If they've worked 30 hours in 2 weeks, they get 30 hours. So whatever it is for new employees, less than 2 weeks. So compensation is at the highest of the regular rate of pay for the work week in which leave is taken. You calculate your regular rate of pay, how you would normally calculate regular rate of pay. You take total earnings, not included overtime, divide it by hours. And you look at that over 90 days, that rate. You look at the state minimum wage, or if there's some higher local minimum wage, whichever is the highest of those, that is what the leave is paid at. So, and remember again, it's 100% for everything. So 100% for everything. Again, it's for exempt employees. It's the same way you would calculate their wages. You take their salary, you divide it by 52 weeks, and you end up with a weekly average, and they get two weeks worth of that. You're not required to pay more than $511 per day, or $5,110 in aggregate to supplemental paid sick leave. But once they've utilized that, they're still entitled to take other leave if they've got other leave available. So you keep that in mind. So here's, again, just more calculating this. I'm assuming you all know how to calculate regular rate of pay and whatnot, but this is just more on how you do that. So you're required to post a poster on the new supplemental paid sick leave. Here is a link to both the English poster, and they just put out the Spanish poster. So the Spanish poster is now available. I don't know why in California it takes them so long to put out the Spanish poster. It takes them, a week after the English poster to get out. I don't quite understand that in California, but it does. But it is now available. There's the link to both of them. Again, we talked about this has to be on the check stub. If you can't get it on the check stub, you can put it on another document and issue it each payday, but they have to get notice on their stub of how much they have available. And then when they are taking it, you're going to show the deductions and what is left, right? You're going to show how much they have. Again, here we talked about this variable stuff, and we've sort of talked about that already. Retroactive applications. So this is where it gets a little tricky. Again, we talked about this a little bit, but it goes back in time to January 1, 2021. And if you continued the Federal Act payments from last year and you paid for leave in 2021 with that act, those payments count toward the California requirements for this year. Doesn't work the other way. You can't say, hey, they took hours last year, so they don't get hours this year. This is a new act. It's a new entitlement. You can't say, hey, they took 80 hours last year, so they get nothing this year. This is a new 80 hours or pro rata share thereof, right? But if you continued payment under the Federal Act after January 1 of this year, 2021, then you are going to be in compliance with the state act, and you can show, hey, I paid 14 hours of federal COVID sick pay, and that qualifies as my retroactive payment under the California Act. So it's an hour for hour. You can swap them out. So as long as you're making those payments or had been making those payments, then you're in compliance. If you didn't do that, that's where it becomes difficult, because if you don't have records of why they took time off earlier this year, 2021, if you don't have records of why they took time off, you're kind of stuck with taking their word for it. because it's up to them to designate that they want to take the hours, and we are not allowed to ask for certification. Now, like I said earlier, if you have a situation where somebody says, hey, I took 3 days off for COVID, I was sick with COVID symptoms and I want supplemental pay, but you've got something in your system that says they, went to a wedding, then you can challenge them on it. But otherwise, we kind of have to take their word for it. The interplay with the tax credits, again, I am not a tax attorney. See, I even put it in red. Consult your tax professional. If you again, though, the basics are, if you continued the FFCRA payments, you can count that towards the California supplemental paid sick leave and still take those quarterly tax credits. And if you paid out more than your tax, you're going to get a refund of that amount. But remember, again, it only works if the leave qualifies under both the state act and the federal act. So if it's one of those qualifying reasons, and you can do it under the federal act, do it under the federal act and take the credit toward the state act. And you can also get these tax credits against your quarterly payroll taxes. Again, consult your tax professional on exactly how to do that. I don't know the ins and outs of doing the tax payments, but that's the general rule right there. So this is just a brief summary of what the federal Family First Coronavirus Relief Act leave qualifications were, subject to a quarantine or isolation order. Okay, so that's the same as the state act. Advised by healthcare provider to self-quarantine due to coronavirus. That's the same as one of the state rules. Experience symptoms and seeking medical diagnosis. Again, that's a state rule too. Caring for an individual who's subject to isolation order or advised to self-quarantine. That's currently one of the state rules. Caring for a child if it's closed, if the school or daycare is closed, that's one. And then experiencing any other substantially similar conditions set forth by the Secretary of Health and Human Services after consultation with the Secretary of the Treasury or the Secretary of Labor. They never did issue any of those. So, pretty much if they're taking leave, it's going to qualify under both, and you're going to be able to supplement federal paid leave for state paid leave, or I'm sorry, yes, for state paid leave, and take that that tax credit. So I hope that makes sense. I've seen some questions.
Yeah, we've got some questions going on now. Carol's got a question. Has under the federal COVID family leave that's been extended to September 30, is it? I'm talking about the 10 weeks at 2/3 pay to take care of children. Is that still in play?
That is not in play. Okay. And it's not a state reason. So that one's not. The state has if the school's closed, whatever, but again, that's only for 80 hours. That's not a 10-week thing like was under the federal act.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. Yeah. What if you've got an employee that took COVID sick pay last year? Can they take it again this year?
Yes, it's a different set of hours. It's totally separate. So if somebody took 80 hours last year, they can take 80 hours this year. It's totally different set of reasons.
Yeah, in 2020 it expired December 31st, and now we have this new. Okay,
yes,
perfect.
Exactly.
And what happens if your employee has met their 80 hours? What do you do?
If they've already used 80 hours?
Yep.
Then if you've got their 3 days or 24 hours, or you've got some other employer provided leave, they're entitled to that. Otherwise, it's unpaid leave.
Okay.
So I think what you would want to do at that point is look at, you have to sort of expand things and say, now is it an FMLA leave? Is it CFRA leave that they're entitled to up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave? Are they, is it a disability that you would have to accommodate with potential leave? There's all that other stuff you're still going to have to look at, but everything else is going to be unpaid.
Okay. So even if they are out because of COVID, like they're a long hauler, what they're calling them, and they're still out under the Cal OSHA ETS, does that, from what I read about the ETS, that we need to compensate employees?
The ETS, and wow, that's a whole nother topic. But
Oh yeah, I'm sorry.
yeah, the ETS is no, that's fine, because I understand we have to try and intertwine
Merge
that.
all these together, right? Yeah.
Yeah, the thing about the ETS is it provides much less paid leave than you would think. Because here's the thing, if you're out sick with COVID, you're not qualified for the ETS pay because you're not available to work.
Gotcha.
Right. So
Yeah.
the paid leave under the ETS is much narrower than people think it is. And what happened was they came out with it and they were interpreting it fairly broadly. And a bunch of us jumped down Cal OSHA's throat and said, "Hey, you don't have the right to make this a regulation providing paid leave," and challenged them in court. And even though we lost the first round in court, they backed off and put out some FAQs that changed their interpretation.
Okay.
And said that it's really it's actually pretty rare to get paid leave under the ETS.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's really, really helpful.
Good.
Good. So Amanda's got a question about, she had an employee that was hospitalized back in December through this March due to COVID. She paid him his 80 hours, then the 10 weeks at 2/3 pay, but he's still ill. Does he qualify for the 80 hours now on this new law? But he's still off work.
If the person used, and I didn't quite catch the time frame there, but if they've already, it sounds like they would have already used 80 hours this
Yes.
year.
From what I'm reading, yes.
From what I'm reading, they've used the 80 hours this year. So no, they're out of time. They're out of the 80 hours.
Okay. Leslie is asking if we're planning on paying our employees under the federal guideline in order to take the federal tax credit, do our postings have to reflect the federal guidelines, or is the state posting sufficient?
I would post both of them. If you're utilizing the federal law, keep the federal poster up.
Okay. Tina is asking, how are we supposed to receive documentation to support our tax credits if we cannot ask employees for documentation?
We're asking for a reason that doesn't condition their leave on it. We're asking for purposes of getting our tax credit. It's a different reason. You want to make sure that you're clear that you are not saying that your leave or your pay is conditioned upon verification, but because we can take a credit that helps us stay in business and helps us pay for this stuff, we need XYZ documentation. You can ask for it that way.
Okay. So if an employee had a reaction to a vaccine back in February and took company paid sick pay, do we automatically reinstate the company paid sick pay and reduce the supplemental paid sick leave available?
So that's a tricky one, because you know why they took it. You've got the reason, but remember, it's up to the employee to request the paid supplemental paid sick leave. I wouldn't ever automatically change it for somebody, because what's going to happen if you automatically change it for them and now next month they get COVID again, or they get COVID and they need to take time off, or they've got to take time off to care for a family member, and you say, "Oh no, I changed your February leave to COVID hours and you don't have any hours." And they're going to say, "Well, I didn't ask you to do that. I didn't authorize you to do that." So I would not automatically change anything. If somebody doesn't ask to have it changed, remember, they have to ask. So if they don't ask to have it changed, you don't have to change it, and I wouldn't automatically change it.
Could you have a conversation with them though?
If you want to, you can say, "Hey, look, you took qualifying leave back in February, and we can give you the supplemental paid sick leave and put back 3 days of whatever it might have been of regular sick leave if you want." and they can say yes or no. You can ask them if they want that, but I would not automatically do it.
Okay. No, talk to your employee first.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Getting the vaccine or being sick from the vaccine covered under the federal law?
The federal law does not mention the vaccine. What it talks about is getting a medical diagnosis, which the vaccine is not a diagnosis. But if you had an example like the question we had just previous to this, if someone gets the vaccine and then gets ill with it or from it, I would think that would be covered, because it talks about being ill with COVID symptoms. But the federal law does not talk about the vaccine.
Yeah, so Leslie asked, does the federal cover vaccination time off? So only if they ended up experiencing symptoms, then that would apply. Okay.
Yeah. But like the California one specifically talks about going to get the vaccine being a qualified reason. So that's about, as I'm recalling, the only reason that doesn't translate over to the federal reasons. I think all of the other ones are covered by the state. All the federal ones are covered by the state, and the state adds the vaccine one.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Okay, lots of questions coming through.
No worries.
Will this presentation be sent to us? Absolutely, yes. Pat, is that okay?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, not a problem. Yeah, free.
I'm like, I better
you can't have it
first.
Yeah. You should have been taking screenshots. No, you're fine. Yeah.
Are we allowed to ask an employee why they needed time off when they request time off?
Of course. You're always allowed to ask. If somebody's supposed to be at work and they're not showing up for work that day, you're allowed to ask why. And if you think about it this way, there's all sorts of reasons why you would need to know somebody's not there. Do they qualify for FMLA or CFRA leave? What is it going to be? You need to know why someone who's not at work is, or why someone who's supposed to be at work isn't there. You're allowed to ask why, always.
Okay, great. And then we've got another one. How do we count for both federal hours and California hours on the employee's paycheck if we were using them both at the same time?
I would list them both and make them agree with one another.
Okay.
So I would list FFCRA hours and SPSL hours, and in theory those banks should be the same, except for the one vaccination time that isn't a federal one. And so you're going to have different banks on there. Okay.
And then we all have an update. Somebody just sent a note that the new federal law, HR 1319, now includes immunizations.
Okay.
So we have to go check that out.
Yep. I hadn't heard of that one, so I'll find out.
Check that one out. And then if an employee is out sick due to COVID-19 symptoms, but does not seek a medical diagnosis, are they able to use their 80 hours?
The qualifying reason listed says out and seeking a diagnosis, so no.
Okay. Okay, I think we covered most of them, most of the questions. If we did not get to your question, I know Pat's going to end up putting up his contact details. And so I believe that you are all more than welcome to send him a note if we did not get to your question.
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right. Thanks, Pat. Okay. Do you want to keep trucking?
Yeah, let's go on. So we talked a little bit about the Cal OSHA exclusion pay. You can remember the thing. First, we talked about the Cal OSHA, the ETS exclusion pay. A, it's much more limited than people think, but B, you can require somebody to utilize this stuff, the supplemental paid sick leave, before Cal OSHA exclusion pay under the ETS. So even if they were qualified under the ETS, you can still say, hey, you're required to use this first, even though you can't make them use this. If they don't choose not to use this, then they would never get to the Cal OSHA exclusion pay. Okay. Does that make sense? I hope that that's kind of convoluted, but I hope that makes sense. Interplay with state disability. You can't require covered employees to use disability in lieu of or before the supplemental paid sick leave, but they may apply for and be qualified for SDI after they've utilized all their supplemental paid sick leave. So if they still can't return to work, they can apply for supplemental, state disability. And I think I just got a question that said that didn't make sense. So, so going back to the California Cal/OSHA ETS exclusion pay. Okay, we talked a little bit about the fact that the ETS talks about, when people are excluded due to COVID, various COVID reasons, they're entitled to be paid. The interpretation of that is much narrower than you would think, and there's very little that actually gets paid under there. If, however, they are entitled to get paid under that, you can require them to use the supplemental paid sick leave, the COVID supplemental paid sick leave, before they would get exclusion pay. The tricky thing is that we can't require them to use the COVID supplemental paid sick leave. So if they choose not to, they would never get to a situation where they would be entitled to the Cal/OSHA exclusion pay. It's kind of circular reasoning, because we can't require them to use this, but if they don't get to the Cal/OSHA exclusion pay. So it's up to them. If they ever wanted to use it, if they said, hey, I want to use the California or the Cal/OSHA ETS exclusion pay, but I don't want to use my COVID supplemental paid sick leave, we don't have to allow them to use, they're not qualified for the ETS exclusion pay because they have available leave that they're not utilizing. I realize that's convoluted, but I hope whoever asked that question, I hope that makes a little more sense. If not, reach out to me afterwards and I'll try and make more sense. So we talked about SDI. Record keeping, you have to keep these records for 3 years. So you have to show their bank and when they used, what date they used and how many hours. And the labor commissioner is allowed to come in and ask to see that. I've had various clients get requests from different labor commissioner offices saying, hey, show us the proof that or that you're complying with this law. And you have to show that, hey, I've got XYZ employees that took leave on this day and this day and this day, and I paid them. And you have to have the records. They're entitled to come in and ask to see that. Same thing with employees, they're entitled to ask to see their records. They can ask to see this. And so you have to have these records for a minimum of 3 years. Here's the link to the supplemental paid sick leave FAQs. Again, please read them. Go through and read them. I've been really impressed. Like I said, I've been doing this almost 30 years, and the state usually does a horrible job of explaining things. But with the COVID stuff, they've actually done pretty good work of explaining this stuff, and these FAQs are pretty darn good. So it's not long. It's not a long read. Please go read it and check it out. All right. Let's see, what else do we have? Here's just some resources that you can go to. We've got the poster and the FAQs. You've got my website and some other stuff on here. There's the IRS guidance on the tax credits that explains that much better than I can. And I think that is all of my info. So why don't we go back to the questions and see what questions we've got up.
So Carol has asked, may we require them to use their vacation before Cal/OSHA exclusion pay?
Oop, I don't know what I just did.
No worries.
Okay, I closed out something, but I'm sorry about that. Okay, so what was the question again?
Oh,
can we freak myself out?
No worries, no worries. Can we require, I'm sorry, now I lost it in my chat. Can we require employees to use their vacation before their...
The Cal/OSHA exclusion pay?
Yeah.
I don't have that information in front of me, but I believe so, yes, you can. And
Okay.
again, that Cal OSHA exclusion pay is really limited. It's very limited on who can take it and for what reason. It's really kind of limited.
Okay. If an employee used their federal hours, so 40 last year and was left with a balance of 40, even after, hold on a second. There we go. Where's chat? Sorry, I lost my chat. So they had a balance of 40 left, even after we extended it this year. Do we still have to provide a new 80-hour balance for the supplemental paid sick leave?
Yes. So the new California is 80 hours, right? And so even if somebody used all 80 hours last year of both the federal and the state from last year, this provides a brand new up to 80 hours for a full-time employee. So regardless of what they took last year, they get 80 hours under this law for this year up until September 30th. Now, if they had a 40-hour balance of the FFCRA from last year, what that does is allows us to use 40 hours of the FFCRA this year, take the tax credit, then you're going to have 40 hours left over where under the state where you don't get the tax credit, but you'd be able to take 40 hours and get the tax credit for 40 hours.
Okay.
Hope that makes sense.
Yeah. Lori's asking a question about QuickBooks, and they have not been as timely as they should be regarding the programs to show this pay on their pay stubs. How long do we have to get it showing on the pay stubs? Like essentially, how long do we have?
You're not going to like this answer. It's the very first check stub after March 29th, for the first full pay period after March 29th, that check stub. So if QuickBooks doesn't do it, you're going to have to make up a separate page that shows this, because the statute is very explicit. You have until the very first check stub on the first full payroll after March 29th. So if March 29th puts you in the middle of a pay period, right, and you issued one check stub since then, and your next one is going to be a full pay period after March 29th, it has to be on that one. That's the latest it can be.
I'm sorry, Lori.
Sorry, Lori.
Vineyard Professionals, yes, we're going to put up the link for the FAQs. We'll send that out to all of you after the webinar, so you'll get a recording of the webinar, the slides, and the link for the FAQs. And then Yvette asked the question, for piece rate employees, do we have to pay them their average hourly rate 90 days prior to their leave?
Yeah, so we go back to that formula in there, and it tells us, how long we have to go back, but I want to say it's not 90 days. I think under this law, it's 6 months. Okay. So you look back over that time frame and calculate it out.
Okay.
It's a little different than last year. I think last year was 90 days, right? I think this year it says 6 months. But the formula was on the slides.
Oh. All right, one came in. So if an employee went on their own time on a Sunday to get vaccinated before 3/29, do I wait for the employee to request the pay out of their supplemental paid sick leave?
Yes. So remember, this is something that is on them to request. We don't have to automatically do it, and I wouldn't automatically do it. They have to request it. So I think for the retroactive stuff in particular, they're going to have to go back and say, hey, look, I had a qualifying reason, a month ago that I want retroactive pay for. The stuff going forward, however, is going to be much more hard, because once it's going to be harder to deny. They're going to have to say, hey, I'm going to get the vaccine. For me, that's sufficient to put you on notice that they're entitled to supplemental paid sick leave, and they're asking for it. I wouldn't want to be the test case that has to go to court and say, hey, they told me they're going to get a leave, but they didn't, or get a vaccine, but they didn't ask for supplemental paid sick leave. You're going to lose that one.
Yeah,
I think.
think you're right. Myra's asking, does it remove overtime wages, the premium, or overtime hours from the calculation?
I believe it does, but don't quote me on that. The formula is in the slide presentation. Yes.
And a year-round employee that is full-time, when does their 80 hours benefit start?
January 1, 2021. It's retroactive back to January 1.
Okay. And ladies and gentlemen, that is it in terms of questions. So thank you all for typing in your thoughts and questions. And Pat, thank you so much for helping us navigate this.
Absolutely. Good questions, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you all. Have a great day. And if you need something else, never hesitate to let us know.
Yep.
Take care. Bye-bye.